Alex,
Can you hear me now?
now I got you. Okay.
All right.
I've got all three of my guests, which, by the way, I can see them even when I can't hear them because we live stream the show. So you can watch too. You can watch on YouTube or Facebook. You just search KUOW Public Radio. And we have another participant here for a few minutes with us to begin the show as well, because as you know, the U.S. Supreme Court this morning officially overturned the constitutional right to an abortion. And we're going to discuss with our panel in a moment. First, we have from the KUOW newsroom, reporter Eilise O'Neill is joining us. Eilise, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
So as we know, the Supreme Court ruling ends the federal protection of abortion rights. States have more leeway now to make their own abortion restrictions. Abortion is legal in Washington state up to the point of fetal viability. So Eilise, what is the latest estimate for how many people are going to come here from other states seeking abortions?
About a 400% increase in the number of people seeking abortions in Washington. Some activists say that's on the low end, actually. The expectation is that people will fly into the Seattle area from faraway states and also drive to Eastern Washington clinics, mainly from Idaho.
Right. Idaho has that trigger law tied to the Supreme Court ruling. So very extreme restrictions coming from Idaho in the next 30 days. So Eilise, the Washington clinics that provide abortions, what are they going to do to prepare for this influx?
They're doing everything they can. They're increasing hours, adding Saturday clinics, hiring more staff, some of that staff coming from states where abortion is going to be illegal very soon. Planned Parenthood has launched a hospitality fund, what they're calling a hospitality fund, to help people travel to Washington for abortions. One abortion provider in Washington state, the Cedar River Clinics, they actually opened a whole new clinic in Yakima last week. So clinics that provide abortions in Washington state are really trying to ramp up to meet the increased demand. But at least in the short term, there's just no way to increase services enough to meet the entire influx that's expected.
And what is that going to mean for residents of Washington state?
It will be harder to get an appointment. There will be longer wait times for an appointment. And if you're pregnant, every week you wait for an appointment is a big deal. I mean, you might move from the first trimester into the second trimester while you're waiting for an appointment. And then the abortion becomes more complicated, more expensive. The people who will be hit the hardest will be the people in Eastern Washington, because there already aren't very many clinics there. There already are long wait times for appointments in Eastern Washington. And if you don't have much money or access to reliable transportation, say if you live in a rural area, don't have a car, need to drive to a city for an abortion, if you don't have access to childcare or money to pay for childcare, those are going to be the people who are affected the most. And so when wait times get longer for appointments, it will be poor rural Washington residents who are hurt the most.
And Eilise, how will the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling here affect the abortion providers of Washington state?
Well, anti-abortion rights activists are trying to make it illegal for an abortion provider in a state where abortion is legal to provide an abortion for the resident of a state where abortion is illegal. So say for a Washington provider to give an abortion to an Idaho resident. And so what the Attorney General and legislators in Washington state are doing is trying to shore up legal protections for Washington providers, making sure that they can provide abortions for anyone who walks into their clinics in Washington state without legal ramifications.
Okay, thank you for that information. That's KUOW reporter Eilise O'Neill. Before we say goodbye, Eilise, I know our listeners are seeing people take to the streets across the country. What events should listeners know about that are happening now, today, or this evening?
There are two protests planned for downtown Seattle today. Those are both at 5 p.m. And there's a protest planned for Olympia tomorrow. And there will probably be additional spontaneous protests as well.
Yeah, I've heard about possible the location for this evening's protest in Seattle maybe being the Federal Building and Westlake, but can you confirm or deny there?
That sounds right.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll see. That's Eilise O'Neill, KUOW reporter, joining us from the newsroom. Thanks for the update and the information, Eilise.
Thanks for having me.
You're listening to Week in Review on KUOW, and local journalists come together and give you information and analysis. And I want to turn to the folks on our panel today. Why don't I start with Publicola's editor and publisher, Erica Barnett. Erica, where do you want to take off from that information about what the U.S. Supreme Court ruling today means for Washington?
Yeah, I mean, I think Eilise was making a good point that a lot of people, will continue to not have access even to, so-called haven states like Washington, because it's very difficult to travel, because it's expensive. And, I think I've mentioned before, I used to work for an abortion rights group. And one of the calls that we got most frequently just out of the blue were people calling, asking for help getting abortions. And usually it was money, people from Alaska, people from Idaho, needing to come here because of, pre-existing restrictions in their own states or for other reasons. And we had to tell them, good luck. Like, here's the number for the abortion funding groups in our area, but they're incredibly, overextended. And I know that there's a lot of people, encouraging donations to abortion access groups, to abortion funds right now, which will help with that. But I mean, there's so many, the idea that Washington is a haven is just wrong. We will be a haven for people who are, wealthy enough to get here and can take time off, and people who are lucky enough to be able to access these very limited abortion funds, and who can take time off and do all the other things, take time off, get childcare for their other kids. But there are no haven states. I mean, right now we're seeing this play out in Texas, where New Mexico is, which has, I think, 6 clinics, is triaging clients from Texas, who often have to drive, 12, 13 hours to get there. And they're triaging people based on how far along they are and based on how far they literally had to travel. And that's resulting in a lack of access. So I think that that to consider us a haven would be a mistake, because it's a very limited haven.
Patrick Malone, Seattle Times, anything to add?
Well, I'd like to kind of step back to what this means nationally and then zoom into Washington a little bit. But this ruling will be very difficult to unravel, especially when paired with sort of the restrictive voting laws that are in vogue at state houses since the 2020 presidential election, and that frankly are designed to favor Republican candidates. So it'll really up the stakes in the state houses. And, the GOP has already been making inroads in many states and sort of establishing the political infrastructure at the local level with getting their hooks into school boards that serve as ladders to higher office. So this has kind of been the flag at the top of the mountain for the GOP for a half century. And I think that as the internal litmus test for whether you're even fit as a candidate to run for office as a Republican, it's not a victory that they're going to hand back to Democrats very quickly. And while Democrats try to regain the ground lost in today's ruling, Republicans in state houses are going to undoubtedly put them on the defensive on issues like contraception and gay marriage that Associate Justice Thomas today hinted are next on the agenda. So today's ruling is a framework that'll have to be navigated around for a long time to come. And its practical effect right now is basically chaos for states where bans will take effect, like Idaho, which takes effect a month from today. And even to an extent, neighbors like Washington that are committed to keeping abortion services available. I read my colleague Nina Shapiro had a really good sort of primer on this, and it talked about everything from, potentially abortion providers from other states, an influx of them coming here to meet demand. And so there's just going to be a lot to logistically unravel. And unfortunately, where does the confusion and chaos land? It's on people seeking services.
Alex Halverson, anything else that our listeners ought to know about this morning's U.S. Supreme Court ruling, the confirmation of what was leaked weeks ago?
Yeah, one thing I'm going to be monitoring is how the companies on my beat respond to subpoenas brought by law enforcement. It kind of piggybacks on what Eilise said. If anti-abortion activists want to make it illegal for people to go from one state to Washington to get an abortion, that's a lot of data that they're carrying along with them. Their location data, their search history, who they're contacting with in Seattle to help them get the abortion. That creates a web of data that Amazon, Facebook, Google, all these companies are sort of tracking. So, if law enforcement brings subpoenas to them, how are they going to respond to that?
Yeah, that's Alex Halverson, tech reporter at Puget Sound Business Journal. And as we're bringing you news and analysis of this morning's U.S. Supreme Court ruling ending the federal protection, the constitutional protection of abortion rights. And again, it sounds like there'll be some events in Seattle, downtown Seattle, Olympia as well, at least. Later on in the Seattle case about 5 o'clock this evening is what we're hearing. And the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, have been very active this week. So I want to turn to another limit on another blue state practice, and that is gun regulation. Basically, the U.S. Supreme Court this week ruled that Americans have the right to carry firearms in public for self-defense. Alex, you've covered crime and shootings. Let's start with you. What does this ruling mean for Washington State?
Yeah, it's not going to have the same effect that it maybe does in other states because it's not targeting a law we have. But when I was a crime reporter, one thing I would always notice is that when you cover a homicide or a shooting, it's very rarely, like a mugging or a crime or anything. It's always two people outside of a bar get into a fight and it escalates, right? And with more people carrying guns, it just creates a more unsafe environment, a more likelihood that someone will use that gun. So we'll see going forward what it means for Washington and their regulations. Kavanaugh's opinion sort of suggests that there's room for regulation with gun reform, or with room for regulation with guns, but everything's up in the air right now.
Yeah, some room, Patrick. It sounds like individual states and maybe localities will be coming up with their regulations based on what they are allowed to designate as an area that's too sensitive for gun carry.
Right. And, that's going to primarily affect places like New York, whose law was specifically struck down on Thursday, and California, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island. But here in Washington State, I learned as I was covering a story recently that convicted felons, for instance, can quite easily get their rights to carry a weapon restored and then very easily get a concealed carry permit. We saw that very recently in the instance of Josh Harris. He is a candidate for Pierce County Council, and people might better remember him as the construction company owner in Tacoma who bailed out 3 Tacoma police officers charged with murder and manslaughter for the death of Manuel Ellis, who was a Black pedestrian who suffocated in their custody in March 2020. But Harris has a past felony conviction for stealing from a customer. He had altered checks to increase their amounts and pleaded guilty, but he later petitioned the court to get his right to possess a gun restored, and it was granted. Then he sought a concealed carry permit in Pierce County, and it was granted. And within days of my story exposing that A, Harris had a felony, and B, he had gotten gun rights restored, he actually wounded a homeless man who Harris said was driving at him with the same concealed permit or same concealed weapon that he had openly discussed with me on the phone. So states that have had a higher standard for denying concealed carry permits will now have to accept some of these sort of realities, like what happened with Mr. Harris, while their legislatures try to nibble at the margins of this ruling.
Before we hear from Erica, I want to understand your take then on what the Supreme Court gun regulation ruling means for Washington State as opposed to some of these other states you mentioned. What are you saying there about how we're in a different position from places like New York?
Well, Washington is already fairly permissive in its granting of concealed carry permits. Yes, you do have to reapply for this, and that might be something that becomes a subject of debate in the legislature about whether even this sort of modest speed bump to getting a concealed carry permit might be removed. But really, that's what it is. It's a very modest speed bump. And, frankly, now it's practically automatic when someone gets a felony. And once again, this is if it's someone of means, someone who has a lawyer who doesn't abandon them at the moment of disposition of their case. This is the kind of thing that the day your probation ends or the day you walk out of prison, you can be, essentially eligible to get a concealed carry permit here in Washington State. And that's not so different from the law prior to yesterday's ruling.
Erica, Barnett, this U.S. Supreme Court ruling this week on gun regulations, how do you think it affects us here?
Well, I mean, as others have said, I mean, it doesn't have an immediate direct effect. I do think that the trend of judicial overreach at the Supreme Court and the trend of legislating conservative laws essentially from the court, including Roe v. Wade, including another case where, the Miranda rights were essentially overturned. You can't sue if the police violate your right to protect yourself against self-incrimination. This trend is not going away. And I think it would be foolish to assume that this is going to be the last time the Supreme Court weighs in on something like guns. And in fact, in this decision, I believe it was Clarence Thomas, I could be wrong, but the decision essentially said that any gun rights that do not date from, effectively the mid-19th century and that were not on the books then and before can be called into question. So I think, we'll see the court taking up cases potentially about permitting in general, about age restrictions, red flag laws, things like that we do have in Washington state. So I don't think that I think this is just a first step in dismantling the right, your right and my right to not be on a bus with 40 people armed to the teeth with AR-15s. And I think we're going to see more steps in that direction from this court.
Monica, Erica, you mentioned red flag laws. How significant do you think it is that Congress did pass some gun regulation? That's a rare thing. Just today, some things like expanded background checks for gun buyers under 21, giving authorities time to examine mental health records beginning at age 16, and then at least money for these, as you said, so-called red flag laws that Washington state has, letting officials temporarily confiscate guns from people if they're found by a court to be too dangerous to own them. So I'll start with you and any other one who wants to weigh in. How significant is this here in our state overall?
Well, I think, Congress is at this point kind of spitting in the wind on these issues. The legislation that passed was pretty modest. And, again, was immediately sort of, not overturned by the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court, essentially, waved away the concept of gun restrictions that weren't in place, and weren't contemplated by the founders of the U.S. So I think, especially if, assuming that Democrats don't win, big in this year's elections, which seems unlikely, we're just, that's probably as much as gun rights advocates are going to get. So I'm not the least bit optimistic that, we're not going to continue going in the direction of, allowing people to be armed to the teeth in dead cities without, proper oversight, background checks, et cetera.
Well, Alex, my understanding was that this New York state law that got struck down involved people having to demonstrate that they have they have a good reason to carry a gun for their defense, and that maybe the Supreme Court allowed for the continued use of more content neutral regulations like background checks, that they weren't forestalling some of those regulations. Do you have anything more to say about where Washington state stands on gun regulation today?
I really don't. I think Erica summed it up pretty well, as did Patrick. We don't have the same laws that New York did that triggered this. So it is going to be different. Yeah.
Patrick, anything to add?
Well, I would just add that essentially what Congress has been passing this week was written in invisible ink, thanks to the ruling that came down yesterday, because at its core, it limited states' ability to judge whether someone is unfit to possess a firearm. It said that the Constitution trumps that. And that is not so different from the roads that Erica suggested, legislation and court rulings might be going down next.
Finally, speaking of shootings, one of Seattle's most controversial police shootings finally went to an inquest this week, 5 years after it happened. We're going to discuss that and more when we return on KUOW's Week in Review with Seattle Times Patrick Malone, Publicola's Erica Barnett, Puget Sound Business Journal's Alex Halverson, streaming the whole thing on YouTube or Facebook. You can go watch the show when you search KUOW Public Radio. We're going to take a quick break and be right back.
This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:27. Sunny and 70 degrees in Seattle. We'll hit the mid 70s today and get into the 80s over the next few days.
Support for KUOW comes from Valentine Roofing, reminding homeowners to get 3 bids when planning for any home improvement project. Valentine Roofing offers a range of home improvement project services, including roof and window replacements and new gutter installations. More information and scheduling of estimates for all their services at valentineroof.com.
You're with KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. Police violence against Black people. It's been a major feature of national politics, Seattle politics for years. And one reason locally is the 2017 fatal police shooting of Charleena Lyles 5 years ago. And yet the inquest hearing into that shooting didn't happen until this week. Patrick, will you first remind us what happened that day in 2017?
Right, and there's certainly some very grim details. Charleena Lyles had called police to report a burglary at her residence, and she was someone known to police. She had had struggles with mental illness. They had visited her at that same location just a couple weeks earlier. Things turned pretty confrontational then, but she was young, just 30, and pregnant when police responding to that burglary call shot and killed her in her own apartment in front of her children as she allegedly, based on the words of the police officers, waved a pocket knife at her. That she waved a pocket knife at police. They responded by shooting her multiple times, killing her in front of her children. And Miss Lyles, like I said, young, 30, and pregnant at the time. So sort of the central point of this inquest, I think, for a lot of people following it closely, is whether it will truly change anything about the way law enforcement approaches people from groups that some officers have shown us through their actions they consider a nuisance. And people with mental illness, like Miss Lyles, certainly fall into that category. And to some officers, quite honestly, so do people who come from backgrounds other than white. We've seen that. But the details are just so grim in this case that, in addition to dying in front of her children, one of her infant children called on top of her dead body, we learned during this inquest. And neither of the 2 white officers who shot her rendered any medical aid as some really critical minutes passed waiting for the next wave of responders. So it's almost reminiscent to me, as more comes out in this, of the Manuel Ellis case I've covered extensively in Tacoma, where he said, "I can't breathe, sir." And an officer responded, "Shut the F up." Now that officer who said that is charged with murder. But no realistic policy change is going to instill a higher regard for humanity or certain human lives from the police. And when I talk to people, a lot of Black people from here and Tacoma, that's what I think shocks the average Washingtonian paying attention to this case. But, the subtext of this inquest is whether police value these lives that they take before they take them. And the inquest is unlikely to answer those questions, at least not directly. But from a strictly legal standpoint, it's a critical inquest because it's just the second test of this new set of standards designed to make the process more equitable towards the people that police hurt. And instead of just deciding whether an officer reasonably feared for their lives before killing someone, these new standards allow the inquest juries to decide whether officers followed the law and their own department's policies. So officers are required to testify, but they can again, invoke their Fifth Amendment right. And the sausage making for this overhaul just really stretched out a long time and included the Supreme Court. So this isn't very common. It's been 5 years. And now we kind of finally get to see whether all of these reforms, all these changes are going to make any sort of meaningful change in the way officers operate on the street. And I think that's a central question in people's hearts.
Yeah, Alex, you were telling me about a little more about the delay, the 5-year delay, and the role of the King County Executive Dow Constantine.
Yeah, as I understand it, in 2017, Dow Constantine had a task force review the process, arguing that it favored police. And maybe he had a point. No officer had been charged with a death since 1971. That officer was acquitted in that case. His decision was fought in the courts over the next 4.5 years. And then finally, the Washington Supreme Court upheld the changes to the inquest process, right? Including allowing for expert testimony and witnesses and much of what Patrick was talking about. Law enforcement agencies had sued over the changes. That's why it went to the Supreme Court. But, that was the reason for the 4.5 year delay. And now we're here with the end result.
Erica, what's your take on the impact of this inquest hearing at last into this death of Charleena Lyles?
Well, I think that, as others have said, I mean, it definitely is bringing up a lot of the, grim and incredibly sad details. There was, testimony by a couple of neighbors the other day who, essentially grabbed the children after they were, taken outside and were comforting and trying to take care of them. And, it was very emotional. There were graphic photos shown. I've been watching online, so I didn't see the photos. They restricted them from the view of the general public. But, I think raising the issue of police shootings and the necessity or lack thereof of, shootings like this, back into the public eye. I do think that the inquest process, is not designed to determine guilt or innocence. It's not a criminal process. So it's very limited in what it can demonstrate, right? So basically the question is, were they following the law as it existed at the time? Since the shooting, the voters passed I-940, which makes it easier to bring criminal charges against police. But again, that is not going to impact this inquest. But, it has been, there have been very, very, tragic and sad and emotional details. And I think that they would not tend to produce sympathy for the police officers in this case. I mean, you're talking about a 5'3", 110-pound woman facing two large men in her kitchen, quote unquote armed with a very small knife. Sounds like they didn't hesitate. And the fact that they kind of didn't render aid, one of the officers described as basically freezing and doing nothing. And other officers had to rush in to this kind of chaotic scene. I mean, it does not paint the police officers or SPD in a favorable light.
And Erica, can you or any of our panelists tell us what could happen because of the inquest? Are we talking about discipline, financial settlement, change in policy? What could this add up to?
Maybe someone more familiar with the inquest process could take this. I don't think that there's a financial, that the Lyles family has received a $3.5 million financial settlement, but perhaps somebody more familiar with the process can explain like what happens at the end of it.
Mainly settles the disciplinary case with the officers. I mean, as far as its specific function relative to charging, I think that that's something that is in the county prosecutor's arena, and I think that ship has sailed in this case. But things can always change on that front. But as far as the specific role of this inquest, it relates to the officers and their actions professionally.
But then we still have an accountability process where sometimes decisions get overturned. There are union rights involved. So how much would we expect the ruling that comes out of this inquest hearing to be a final one?
For one thing, these terminations are frequently overturned. I've been looking at some of this type of stuff lately, and there are some egregious cases in Washington State where, as rare as it is, a department has said, man, you went too far. And even in those cases, arbitrators tend to really, things turn out favorably for these officers in a lot of these cases.
Erica, how much would you say, I mentioned this, how this shooting has been part of the backdrop of Seattle politics and how that fits into the national politics. How much would you say the Lyles shooting had to do with Seattle Black Lives Matter protests, calls to defund police, officers leaving the Seattle Police Department?
Well, I would say, those are different things. I would say in the case of sort of calls to defund and dramatically change the role of police, the Lyles shooting had a tremendous impact. I as far as officers leaving, I think that's happening for a lot of different reasons, and I don't buy the idea that they're leaving because there were protests in 2020. But, I think it's been tremendously impactful. I think among politicians, however, there has been a real reluctance to condemn this shooting. During the George Floyd protests and the protests against police brutality in 2020, Mayor Jenny Durkin, then Police Chief Carmen Best were eager to affirm that they believe that George Floyd was murdered. But I think that, neither would say, and neither ever did say, that Charleena Lyles was murdered. So I think, the impact it had on sort of the political discourse at that level was pretty limited, because, the cops and the mayor don't want to admit, or don't want to potentially acknowledge that they got something wrong, particularly with all this legal process going on. So I thought that was pretty notable at the time.
Did that
and it
surprise you,
remains so.
Erica, given the presence of that knife? Did that different treatment of those two cases, George Floyd and Charleena Lyles, did that surprise you at the time?
Well, I mean, the knife, I've read the documents behind the inquest, and, and seen a picture of the knife. The knife was small, and Charleena Lyles is a small woman. I'm not a police officer. I've never been in that situation, so I'm not going to, say what they should have been thinking or feeling. But, I do think that the cases are similar enough that you can make, they're analogous. This is a woman who had several children in her house with her at the time, and who was known to do things like holding a blade. I mean, she had held a pair of scissors the last time cops had come to her house a couple weeks earlier. And I mean, these officers knew that history when they went in and knocked on her door, and they seem to have disregarded it.
Anything else to add on the Charleena Lyles inquest hearing before we move on?
Just a point of agreement with Erica there, that I think, increasingly the lens narrows in on this very central question of, was it necessary when it comes to these police deaths? Was it necessary to kill her? Was it necessary to kill Manuel Ellis? Was it necessary to kill a whole lot of other people under these questionable circumstances? Or is there another way? And I think that, anything that moves the needle towards considering alternatives to killing people on the streets is somewhat progress, maybe not enough.
Well, I mentioned the defund police movement and the Seattle Police Department being down in its officer count, and so to some extent, these issues spill over into financial ones, which is why I also wanted to bring up the city of Seattle's budget shortfall. I think it was $170 million. Who is that going to affect, the fact that the Seattle is so far short of balancing its books?
Well, it's 117 as of the April projection from the budget office, which is huge. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. They were previously saying, maybe it'll be like 34 million. So this is way more than was anticipated before. It's potentially going to affect every single city department that provides services. I would say typically not the police department, not the fire department. Those typically have never gotten significantly cut. So what usually happens is, other stuff gets cut back. Every department's been asked to make or to come up with a proposal for up to 6% budget reductions. We've seen this before, actually, with under former Mayor Mike McGinn. They had to make major cuts. And they did it largely without cutting human services too badly. But I think it's going to be a combination of cuts and in the future, in 2024 and beyond, trying to come up with some kind of new tax to pay for some of this stuff, because there's a shortfall this year, but then there's shortfalls going out into every year the city projects to, all the way out to 2026, I believe.
Yeah, Alex Halverson, Puget Sound Business Journal. When we don't have an income tax here, when localities tax, lately it's been the big companies, and particularly the tech companies. What are you watching when it comes to budget and taxation locally?
Yeah, I'm watching for some transparency around the Jumpstart tax, specifically what companies are paying into that. There's two options for how companies can, bigger companies can do it. They can, a really primitive way is a less precise way is any employees assigned to a Seattle office, they'll count toward the tax. I have a feeling that may be how Amazon is doing it. They have 61,000 Seattle-based employees, according to an internal headcount tool. And those are based in Seattle. I've referenced that with cross-reference that with employees I know live in maybe Snohomish, but are based in the Day One Seattle building. So hopefully maybe on the city's comprehensive annual financial report, we'll get details on, how much Meta, how much Google, how much Amazon is paying. toward this tax with their employees in Seattle, which are a lot.
Mm-hmm. Patrick Malone, I saw in your newspaper, the Seattle Times, that the city of Bellevue is considering taxing big companies like Amazon the way Seattle does.
Right. And I think that I'm not the expert in this area. I'll be the first to confess, but, just stepping back and looking at it from the generalist as a resident's point of view here, I think there become some questions about, the concessions that have been given to some of the big employers here. That includes Amazon, Starbucks, Microsoft, and, what the community is getting in return. And there are sort of these financial pressure points that are created, economic pressure points for any government that sort of turns its back on income tax, state income tax as a whole. And so, we are seeing localities wanting to tap into this. I don't know that it'll ever really go that way, but it's sort of, what have you done for me lately sort of situation where, as a resident, you got to be asking, are all these concessions and all these contortions that our government gives to these big companies, are we getting enough in return? And so I think that is increasingly becoming something that's on the minds of people around Seattle. And, it might just be sort of naive and a little bit of a generalist point of view, but every time we turn around, these companies are getting what they asked for. And not always are their employees or the people who live around here may be benefiting from that, because really, let's face it, the pay scale from these companies and the amount of money that they just plunge into the economy here, it really does change the quantum physics of living in Seattle. It affects, housing, it affects decisions that are made at City Hall and things like this. And so I think that eventually there comes a time where the citizens want to see more than just the voluntary dribs and drops of philanthropy that are done affecting small slivers of the community. I think there is a growing demand to say, do more for us, companies.
The quantum physics of living in Seattle. Erica Barnett, you follow the money at Publicola. What do you want to say about this?
Well, I think that that this year, we're going to see another the tax that is on, the jumpstart tax on these large companies. I think we're going to see another attempt to kind of claw back that money, which is earmarked in theory, although, it seems like almost every year since it's been in effect, it's gone to other stuff, but it's earmarked for housing. So, there's going to be a battle about that. But I also think, one interesting thing that is happening this year is the city is reconvening, or is supposed to reconvene, this progressive revenue task force to come up with, potential new taxes. Most likely not an expansion of the existing jumpstart tax, though maybe it's been upheld now. But, other possibilities that are outside, as an income tax, which we can't do, like a local estate tax, or taxes on institutions that pay, over a certain threshold of dollars to employees, like $400,000 in compensation. So there are other ideas that are still out there that came out of the last time that task force met, that I think are going to be back on the table, because, we can scarcely afford to be cutting, 117 million this year, and then tens of millions for years and years and years in the future. Even if we do put the police department on the table for the first time, it's not going to be enough to avoid, really devastating impacts.
We'll watch that with Publicola's editor and publisher, Erica Barnett. We've got Seattle Times senior investigative reporter Patrick Malone with us, and Puget Sound Business Journal's tech reporter Alex Halverson, doing it all on YouTube and Facebook, as well as on the radio. So you can watch the live stream. Just search KUOW Public Radio. We're going to take another short break and then come right back with more Week in Review, including a reason to smile. Don't go away.
94.9 KUOW. It's 12:47. Stay with us after a Week in Review for BBC NewsHour, live from London. That begins just about 13 minutes from now on 94.9 KUOW Seattle.
Support for KUOW comes from BECU, a member-owned credit union putting people over profit, offering financial services and support to the community with access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs, and online resources at becu.org, federally insured by NCUA.
And from Bill and Paula Clapp in partnership with Seattle Foundation, saluting the Seattle YMCA for providing summer camps to over 3,000 young people last year. The Y is now expanding these camps to reach even more youth. Learn more about how to help at seattleymca.org/camp.
It's KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. Just as Seattleites are about to celebrate with the Pride Parade this weekend and other Pride Month events, police are investigating an alleged riot plot last weekend at a Pride event in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Police arrested 31 masked members of the white power neo-Nazi type group Patriot Front. This is the police chief there saying that officers were tipped off by a community member who had seen the group loading up a U-Haul van at a local hotel.
I think some of us were a bit surprised by not only the level of preparation that we saw, but the equipment that was carried and worn by those individuals, along with the large amount of equipment that was left in the van when the stop happened.
These 31 defendants came from about a dozen states, some from the Northwest, but a handful from as far away as Alabama and Texas. Patrick, you've learned a lot about this group, Patriot Front, and its plans. What should we know?
Well, first off, when police in Coeur d'Alene caught them, the Patriot Front members had what I would classify as tools of harassment. These were, some tactical shields. They did have some large flags and banners that could have been potentially used as weapons, but I really came to learn a little bit more about this group reporting this story. And that included just reading hundreds of pages of transcripts from, leaked online chats involving some of the very same Washington men who were rounded up in Idaho. And it revealed that they had plans to vandalize targets, around here. Murals for racial justice in Seattle and West Seattle, focusing on college campuses where they would put up propaganda graphics, primarily things like, stickers. Their MO is really, to present sort of a welcoming entree into this life where they then expose people to a little more hardcore racism. But their MO when they're at their most menacing is really to sort of ambush progressive events like the Pride Parade in Coeur d'Alene with disruptive antics that generally fall under the umbrella of protected speech. I mean, these guys are not looking to get arrested or slug it out in the alleys of Portland with anarchists and Black Bloc like the Proud Boys or some of the more confrontational white power groups. To the contrary, these Patriot Front guys spend hours planning, how to carry out their missions that are primarily propaganda spreading without ever being caught or identified. It's really anathema to them to show the world who they are. It's almost like they use these pseudonyms in chats where they don't even know each other's names. It's like KKK members wearing hoods to protect their identity while they carry out whatever they're doing. And so Idaho completely blew up in their faces, and being arrested means being identified. Then bosses, teachers, moms, dads, who a number of these Patriot Front members rely on financially or for housing, all of a sudden know what they're into. And they're frankly kind of sad figures, not a lot of success stories among these guys. The Washington lot is mainly guys in their early 20s who can't seem to even really manage their supply of stickers successfully. But that's not to say that they're not a threat. The sort of crafts and propaganda approach of Patriot Front and its reluctance to use racial slurs on its propaganda materials kind of makes it a target of ridicule from other white power hate groups. But that's sort of stirring a movement inside Patriot Front that's calling for more overt action, more directly racial statements, and potentially more violence. So if this element of the group co-ops it, the cautious rhetoric, the annoying, barely legal behavior might turn more menacing. And there's another insidious element that I've been hearing from readers struck a nerve, and that's Patriot Front's recruitment of teenage boys. One parent who adheres to progressive politics expressed a lot of shock that his son was a part of this white separatist group. And it's out there raising heck in different cities all over the country 5 or 10 times a year. And that's naturally unnerving for some parents I've spoken with who have boys in the age group susceptible to this message. and which is designed to seem sort of outwardly benign, and that's what kind of sucks these kids in, but which spews racism as vile as any other hate group when it thinks no one is looking. And so all of this is done with the objective of making life harder for people in the LGBTQ, Black, Jewish, and immigrant communities. So they are a threat, even though they maybe haven't been as violent as some other groups.
Okay, that's interesting specificity to the charge of conspiracy to riot. We'll see. We'll see how the prosecution comes forward. But any reaction from Alex or Erica to what we know about this Patriot Front group?
I really like what Patrick said about how, this is a group that's not as outwardly aggressive as the Proud Boys or something like that. It's almost like a gateway to radicalization like that, right? They can play on people who have priors, who have prejudices. There's a lot of rural communities in Washington that are segregated or not very diverse. I grew up in Kitsap County. That's not the most diverse area, especially in some communities there. So it can create this sort of gateway of radicalization for, white teenagers, white young men who, maybe have misogynistic circles they're in, they have misogynistic fathers or uncles. And then as you get more enveloped in that world, as it becomes more anonymous, like Patrick said, it can become more violent. So I thought that was really poignant.
Yeah, and I would just say, a couple things. Coeur d'Alene, I think, has been trying very hard to recover its reputation as, I've always kind of known it as the place with the Nazis. Sorry to Idaho.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the details in the story, are really scary and horrific. And also, these groups, maybe not Patriot Front, but certainly the Proud Boys are, doing rallies west of the mountains. And we had a prominent newscaster promoting people coming out and talking to them because, I was not at this rally, but I have to assume that they were not sort of spewing their openly, racist and prejudiced views openly, but presenting sort of a soft front of solidarity and, brotherhood and that kind of stuff to sort of lure people in, and groom them into this belief system, which is really disturbing.
Locally, did anyone see this conversation between the Seattle Pride organizers who said they do not want Seattle police who are in uniform to march in the Pride parade, and the police chief here said, well, then we won't participate in the parade, and called that I think it was disappointing. And we asked some of our listeners about this. We've got this community feedback club that you can participate in, and Mark wrote saying, officers have just as much right to celebrate as everyone else, whether that be in uniform or not. In fact, marching in uniform would demonstrate they have allies inside SPD. Maya wrote, this is not about individuals. This is about whether the SPD as an institution represented by their uniformed officers deserves a marquee spot in the parade without having done, to Maya's knowledge, any meaningful work to admit and repair historical wrongdoing. Joe says, I don't feel free to say anything in the presence of law enforcement due to the imbalance of power and past experience. I understand some are proud of their work and their uniform, but please leave your powerful job and your uniform at home when celebrating Pride with others who are not police. And Greg says, I strongly support Seattle Pride, and I believe that forcing the police to hide in civilian clothes is metaphorically akin to pushing them into the closet. Any reaction to this debate in Seattle as we head into another Pride weekend?
Yeah, go ahead, Erica. I'm sorry.
I was chuckling at that last comment because I think it's deliberately pretty provocative. I mean, police are allowed to march in this parade. They just, have been asked not to wear uniforms. I read the chief's statement. I'm actually quite sympathetic to the idea that, to the fact that there are LGBTQ plus people in the police department, who do not feel, who do want to represent like a more, a different spin on policing, and to say, look, we're here too, but I have to kind of agree that having them sort of representing, the police department rather than themselves, it's just going to cause conflict. And I think this letter that the chief wrote, unfortunately, kind of exacerbates that conflict because you could also just not respond. That's always an option.
Alex?
It seems like one more taking their ball and going home situation from the police in Washington State. We saw the same thing sort of with the law change that sort of limits the amount of force they can use when they encounter people who are in crisis. They just have said, well, then we won't respond at all in some cases. And I'm just wondering if there's some middle ground or some conversation, because when the police don't get 100% their way, sometimes they just say, we're going to abandon you. And that's what's happening with this situation, at least from the perceptions of some.
We are right up at the end of the show. Alex, I want to give you a chance to weigh in as well.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I think that's been lost in all of this is sort of Pride's decision-making process in this. I interviewed the executive director, Crystal Marks, after Seattle Pride announced they wouldn't take Amazon's sponsorship offer for the parade this year. And one thing she really stressed through every question was they listened to a lot more community feedback this year leading up to parade. What do community members want to see? What do they want from the parade? And some of that was, we don't want organizations that we don't think reflect our values. And I think this is a manifestation of that. I think some community members, maybe majority of them, are telling them, we don't want officers in their uniforms in the parade. It's the same thing with the Amazon sponsorship, right? Amazon wanted to emblazon their logo all over the parade. They were going to give them a bunch of money. They were going to be the presenting sponsor and have an Amazon executive speak at the event. And community members told the Pride organization that we don't want that. They're not reflecting our values right now.
Alex Halverson is a tech reporter at the Puget Sound Business Journal, and you've been with Patrick Malone from the Seattle Times, senior investigative reporter there, and Publicola's editor and publisher, Erica Barnett. Thanks for being Week in Review this week, everybody. A jam-packed show, lots to talk about. We really appreciate you being in on the discussion today. And we also want to thank my colleagues here who make this show happen. Producer Kevin Kniestedt, social media and live streaming by Juan Pablo Chiquizi and Tio Popescu, with Bernard Ouellette working the board. I'm Bill Radke, and what I'm smiling about this week is a beaut of an episode of Subtext, which is part of KUOW's new podcast, KUOW Shorts. Find out about KUOW Shorts. Get it wherever you get your podcast. And we're going to do a live event, sort of wrapping up the Subtext series about what goes unsaid. That's Thursday, July 7th, this live event at one of the lecture rooms at McCaw Hall. So find out details and get tickets at kuow.org/events. And I'll see you on stage. I'll be on stage. You'll be in the audience. We'll talk Thursday, July 7th. Sorry I had to jam all that at the end, everybody.
It's cool.
Thank you for that.
No worries.
There was a lot to get to. I really appreciate it all. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having
Thanks,
us.
everybody.
Nice to meet you both, Erica and Alex.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah, you too.
Have a good weekend, team.
Enjoy
Bye.
the sun.